Police,
okay?
we've got a warrant for this address. Step back and keep your hands where I can see them.
Don't shoot, please. This is my home. What's this about?
Doesn't matter. Turn around now.
You're making a serious mistake. I'm the Assistant Attorney General.
I don't care what your title claims to be, but you'll have to explain it in jail. Hands behind your back.
The flashing red and blue lights spilled across the front of the house, like a warning that didn't belong there, pulsing against white siding and glass, as if the street itself had been marked. Oak Street was usually silent at this hour, the kind of place where nothing more dramatic than a late delivery ever happened. Marcus Thompson had pulled into his driveway minutes earlier, tired from a long day at the state capitol, already thinking about dinner and the quiet that came after. The knock at the door came hard, sharp enough to stop him mid-step, carrying an authority that immediately felt wrong. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. When Marcus opened the door, a white officer stood inches from the threshold, body angled forward, eyes already narrowed, as if the decision had been made before a word was spoken. A second officer lingered farther back near the porch railing, helmeted, silent, watching. The body cam on the lead officer's chest blinked steadily, recording the moment Marcus crossed from homeowner to suspect without ever leaving his doorway. Before this goes any further, take a moment to subscribe, hit like, and leave a comment about where you're watching from. Stories like this only have impact when they're seen and shared. The officer didn't introduce himself. He didn't explain why he was there. Commands came immediately, clipped and forceful, telling Marcus to step back and keep his hands visible. Marcus complied without hesitation, palms open, voice calm as he said there must be some kind of mistake. This was his house. He lived here. Oak Street, same address on his license, same one tied to every official record bearing his name. He spoke the way someone speaks when they expect reason to prevail, when logic should be enough to reset a situation that's veering off course. It didn't. The officer leaned closer, crowding the doorway, the body cam tilting slightly with the movement. His tone didn't soften at Marcus's explanation. It hardened. The questions that followed weren't about confirming an address or clarifying a warrant. They were probing, personal, and accusatory. Why was he here? Who else was inside? What had he been doing tonight? Each question carried the same implication, that Marcus's presence in his own home required justification. The porch light cast sharp shadows across Marcus's face, while warm yellow light from inside the house spilled onto the steps behind him. A staircase rose just inside the doorway, quiet and ordinary, a visual reminder that this was a private home being treated like a crime scene. Inside, unseen but alert, his wife listened as the exchange grew more tense, already reaching for her phone. When the officer announced that Marcus was being detained for obstruction, the shift was unmistakable. Obstruction was a word Marcus knew well. He had heard it used in courtrooms, read it in reports, watched it stretched to cover conduct that never should have justified an arrest. It was vague, flexible, and dangerously easy to invoke when an officer needed control without cause. Marcus felt the line being crossed in real time. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He stated a fact. He told the officer he was an assistant attorney general. The words were delivered calmly, without drama, the way one might state a title in a professional setting. Marcus had seen what usually happened when officers realized who they were dealing with. The pause, the recalculation, the sudden politeness. None of that came. The officer dismissed it outright, mocking the claim, signaling that it didn't matter who Marcus was or what he knew. The badge, in that moment, was the only authority that counted. That was when Marcus understood this wasn't confusion. It wasn't a wrong address or a paperwork error that could be fixed with a radio call. This was an assumption. This was bias hardening into action. A decision made the instant a black man opened the door to a house the officer didn't believe belonged to him. The body cam captured everything. Marcus's hands never left view. His posture remained steady. The second officer stayed silent, complicit through inaction. Red and blue lights continued to wash over the house, marking it, transforming it from a home into a stage. Inside, Marcus's wife began recording from the living room, documenting the encounter from another angle, already understanding how important that footage might become. When the handcuffs came out, Marcus didn't resist. He turned slowly, narrating aloud for the camera, stating his name, the time, the location, and the fact that he was being detained in his own doorway without explanation. His voice didn't shake. It carried the controlled precision of someone who knew this moment would be examined frame by frame. Across the street, curtains shifted. A door cracked open. a neighbor stepped onto a porch, phone in hand. What the officer believed was a routine assertion of authority was quietly becoming a documented incident with witnesses, angles, and consequences. Marcus already knew how this would end. He knew body cam footage. He knew of the discovery. He knew that false charges collapsed under scrutiny. And he knew that before this was over, the city would be facing a settlement that would force everyone involved to answer for what happened on that porch. This was only the beginning. Marcus felt the night change the moment he was guided off the porch. The air seemed colder away from the doorway, heavier, as if the quiet street itself was holding its breath. The patrol car sat at the curb with its lights still flashing, washing the neighboring houses in red and blue, and drawing more attention with every passing second. Doors were opening now, not wide, just enough. Enough to see. Enough to record. Marcus kept his eyes forward as he walked, hands cuffed behind his back, shoulders straight, giving the officers nothing they could later twist into resistance. The body cam footage followed closely, bobbing with each step, capturing the crunch of gravel under shoes and the low murmur of a radio crackling to life. The lead officer spoke in short, irritated bursts, narrating his own version of events out loud, as if rehearsing for the report he would later write. Marcus recognized the tactic immediately. Say it confidently enough, early enough, and it starts to sound official. Truth becomes secondary once the narrative is established. When Marcus was placed in the back of the patrol car, the door shut with a dull, final sound that seemed to seal the situation. From inside the vehicle, he could still see his house, the porch light glowing steadily, the front door now closed. Inside, his wife stood frozen, phone in hand, watching her husband disappear behind tinted glass. She didn't know where they were taking him yet. Neither did he. The drive was short but tense. The officer in the front seat spoke into the radio, describing a detention that sounded nothing like what had actually happened. Words like uncooperative and suspicious behavior slipped easily into the transmission. Marcus listened quietly, memorizing phrasing, tone, timing. He knew these details mattered. They always did. At the station, Marcus was led through a side entrance, avoiding the public lobby, avoiding questions. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flattening everything into harsh white clarity. The cuffs stayed on longer than necessary, deliberately. A reminder of who was supposed to feel powerless here. An intake officer glanced at Marcus, then at the arresting officer, and hesitated for half a second before typing. That pause didn't go unnoticed. Marcus identified himself again during booking, clearly, formally, stating his full name and position. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable, a look exchanged, a quiet step away from the desk. A supervisor called over under the pretense of routine procedure. The system was starting to sense friction, even if it wasn't ready to correct course yet. This is where I want you to pause for a moment. If you're still watching, subscribe to the channel, hit like, and tell me in the comments where you were watching from. The next part shows exactly how the system protects its own, until it can't anymore. Despite the unease spreading quietly through the station, the arrest continued. Marcus was placed in a holding room, alone, walls bare, bench cold. Time stretched, minutes passed without explanation. His phone had been taken. No call offered, no clarification given. This wasn't procedure. This was punishment for not folding when expected. Meanwhile, outside the station, the night was already slipping out of the officer's control. Neighbors had shared clips online, short videos, shaky but clear, showing a black man in handcuffs outside his own home, calmly stating his credentials while an officer ignored him. The footage spread quickly, stripped of context by the rawness of what it showed. No shouting, no resistance, just authority pressing down where it didn't belong. Inside the department, supervisors began asking questions, quiet ones at first. The arresting officer stuck to his version, repeating it with growing rigidity. Suspicious behavior, obstruction, standard procedure, but every retelling sounded thinner than the last. Body cam footage was already queued for review. Dispatch logs didn't match his claims. Timelines didn't align. Marcus sat alone, replaying the encounter in his head, not with anger, but calculation. He knew the system's instincts well. Delay, deflect, close ranks. If this were anyone else, the story might have ended quietly in that holding room. A charge filed, a release hours later, an apology that never came. But Marcus wasn't anyone else, and the system was starting to realize that too late. By the time a supervisor finally entered the room, the tone had shifted. Polite, careful, almost deferential. Questions replaced commands, clarifications replaced accusations. Marcus answered them the same way he had answered everything else that night, calmly, precisely, leaving no room for misinterpretation. What the officer thought was a routine detention had triggered something far larger. Internal reviews were already underway. Calls were being made above the station level. And somewhere in the city's legal department, someone was beginning to understand just how expensive this night was about to become. Marcus would eventually walk out of that station, but nothing about this was over. The real battle hadn't even started yet. The tone changed before anyone admitted it had to. It wasn't announced. There was no formal apology, no acknowledgement of error. It showed up in smaller ways first. A supervisor lingering too long over paperwork. A lowered voice. A careful choice of words that hadn't been used earlier in the night. Marcus noticed all of it. He always had. These were the tells of a system realizing it had stepped into something it could not quietly undo. When Marcus was finally released, it was framed as procedural. No charges formally filed. No explanation offered beyond vague references to clarifying information. The officer who had arrested him didn't meet his eyes. The cuffs came off without ceremony, as if removing them could erase the fact they had ever been there in the first place. Marcus walked out of the station just after midnight, exhausted but focused, already organizing the next steps in his mind. Outside, his wife was waiting. She didn't ask questions right away. She didn't need to. She handed him his phone, still warm from the number of messages she hadn't stopped answering. Neighbors, colleagues, people he barely knew who had already seen the footage. What happened on Oak Street had not stayed on Oak Street. By morning, the videos were everywhere, multiple angles, multiple witnesses. The body cam footage, once released under public records, pressure filled in every gap the officer's report tried to blur. It showed the lack of explanation, the absence of cause, the calm compliance of a black man standing in his own doorway while authority pressed forward without justification. There was no resistance, no threat, no ambiguity. Internal Affairs opened an investigation within 48 hours. Not quietly, not informally. Official, documented. The kind that comes with subpoenas and timelines that cannot be ignored. The arresting officer was placed on administrative leave almost immediately, though the department's first public statement avoided assigning blame. They spoke of ongoing review and standard procedures, hoping the language might slow the outrage. It didn't. Local news picked up the story next, then regional outlets, then national coverage. Legal analysts broke down the footage frame by frame, explaining exactly where the officer crossed constitutional lines. Civil rights organizations weighed in. Former prosecutors spoke openly about how easily this could have happened to anyone, without Marcus's position, resources, or knowledge of the law. That detail stuck with people. If this could happen to an assistant attorney general, standing in his own home, calmly asserting his rights, what happened every day to people who didn't have a camera rolling, or a title that forced the system to pause? Marcus filed his lawsuit 2 weeks later. It wasn't rushed, but it was relentless. The complaint laid everything out in precise language, citing timestamps, audio transcripts, policy violations, and constitutional law, Fourth Amendment violations, false arrest, abuse of authority, failure to supervise. The city was named, the department was named, the officer was named. The dollar amount made headlines, $6.2 million. That was the settlement figure demanded, not as leverage, but as consequence. A number large enough that it couldn't be dismissed as a nuisance value, large enough that it would be discussed in budget meetings and council chambers, large enough to force policy changes instead of quiet apologies. Behind closed doors, the city knew they were exposed. The body cam footage was indefensible. Witness videos backed it up. Dispatch records contradicted the officer's claims. Training logs showed gaps that lawyers would dismantle in front of a jury. Every attempt to justify the arrest collapsed under its own weight. They settled before trial. $6.2 million paid out by the city and its insurer. No admission of wrongdoing on paper, but no denial either. The officer was terminated, not reassigned, not quietly transferred, fired. His name is now permanently linked to a case study taught in training rooms as an example of what not to do. Supervisors faced discipline. Mandatory retraining was ordered across the department. Body cam policies were revised. Oversight committees were expanded. All of it framed as progress, but born from a moment that should never have happened in the first place. Marcus returned to work with his record cleared, his reputation intact, but changed, not broken, sharpened. He spoke publicly about the case, not to center himself, but to expose the pattern. He reminded audiences that accountability only arrived here because the evidence was undeniable, and the victim knew how to force the system to listen. Most people don't get that chance. The house on Oak Street looks the same now, same porch light, same quiet evenings. But the night it was flooded with red and blue is part of its history, a reminder of how quickly authority can overstep, and how expensive it becomes when it does. If there's one thing this case proves, it's this. Power unchecked always overreaches, but when it's documented, challenged, and forced into the light, it comes with consequences that can't be ignored. And that's why stories like this matter.